everyone, and welcome to another episode of Accessibility. It's a show on YouTube where I talk about the video game industry, accessibility, and representation. Basically, how can we get more people to be able to play games and to see themselves in the games they play? When it comes to software-based accessibility in the video game industry, one thing that has become pretty much a standard in most AAA games at this point is subtitles. Not all subtitles are created equal. Some games do a better job than others. Some games will allow you to put a backdrop behind your subtitles, or change their size, or change the colour of them, and a bunch of other features. Still, what's really positive is that most games at this point, at least most AAA games or most games that have dialogue, will have some form of subtitles. The fact that subtitles are being adopted as a standard in the video game industry is great. They help so many different kinds of players. Maybe you're a deaf or hard of hearing player and you need that visual input to know what's going on in a story. Maybe you're playing late at night and you don't want to disturb friends or family and you need to turn the sound down on your telly but still know what's being said in-game. I myself find subtitles really useful because, as someone with Asperger's syndrome, which is an autism spectrum condition, I sometimes really struggle with processing different sensory input, and particularly audio. Sometimes, if there's too much other sound going on in a scene, I just can't process what's being said by characters. Subtitles are vital for me to be able to keep up with stories. However, there is one area where video game subtitles still need to improve. Most games, their subtitles and their in-game UI are basically the same font. They're usually picked to be a font that looks aesthetically pleasing, maybe fits with the tone of the game, and there's not usually much other thought put into it than that. Most games will have a single font that they use, or a single set of fonts, and no options to change them, and this is a problem for a lot of players, and that's kind of what we're here to talk about today. For those unaware of dyslexia, here's a brief summary. Dyslexia is a learning condition which impacts the ease with which a person can read, write, spell, and process written text. It can cause written or typed words to appear jumbled, or make words more difficult to keep track of in a sentence. Often, the same sentence will take longer to read for a player with dyslexia than it might for other players. Now, some of you watching this video may not be aware, but there are certain fonts that people with dyslexia typically find easier to read, and some fonts that are more difficult or time-consuming to read with dyslexia. Serif fonts, such as Times New Roman, the font that we all used in school for pretty much everything we ever had to write, or Georgia as a font, often show up on lists of fonts that dyslexic users find difficult to read easily. And fonts such as Comic Sans tend to be easier to read based on studies of dyslexic users. Now, I'm sure you can guess why the video game industry hasn't defaulted to using Comic Sans as a default text in all games. It's often not taken seriously as a font, and likely would look a little out of place in a lot of gaming genres. But the joy of video games is they can be tailored to suit each individual user. You don't have to make something a default font to offer it to some players. Sure, video game industry, keep your default fonts that are designed with aesthetics first and foremost in mind, but unlike books or movies, you can give players options. Include some of the more popular dyslexic sans serif fonts such as Comic Sans. Offer players the use of Open Dyslexic, an open source font that, while not embraced by the whole dyslexic community, was designed with dyslexic users in mind and is helpful for some of them. Offer players with dyslexia the option to bold important words rather than underlining or italicizing them, which can make them more difficult for dyslexic readers to read. Offer a bunch of standardized font options, such as Times New Roman, which on paper should be difficult to read with dyslexia, but is easier for some to read due to its familiarity and commonplace nature. Pair these with settings that allow for subtitle backdrop customization, color customization, and font size adjustability. While you're at it, why not throw in some additional options, things like font spacing? While dyslexia-inclusive font options are far from a standard, they're for example one of the few options The Last of Us 2's extensive disability menu overlooked. There are some games out there right now which are providing these options to players. Overland, a turn-based survival game which recently featured in itch.io's bundle for racial justice and equality, alongside a few thousand other titles, incorporated dyslexia-friendly fonts after feedback received at a convention. Overland only supports Open Dyslexic, which, as previously mentioned, has mixed effectiveness in the dyslexia community, but the fact that it's there as an option at all is a great step in the right direction. The font is also used by psychological horror point-and-click adventure game The Last Door, which was released back in 2013. Again, it was the only font choice offered offered for dyslexic players, but that is a start. The Warlock of Firetop Mountain, a 2016 single-player fantasy RPG themed on a tabletop campaign, is a great example of how to implement dyslexia-friendly fonts correctly. The game, which has a default font full of fancy flourishes and tails on letters, offers an alternative font that keeps the same basic style while being far less full of unnecessary complex details. Beyond that, the game makes offering players a dyslexia-friendly font the very first thing it does, before the game has even begun, to ensure that players don't have to navigate menus that they may be struggling to read in order to find where a legible font is available. In a perfect world, I would love to see, as a standard across our industry, every game offer a couple of different dyslexia-friendly fonts for players to pick from to help those players be able to read in-game text more effectively. That being said, I'm willing to settle for every game having one option for a dyslexia-friendly font. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be a huge step in the right direction for developers thinking about this problem and making steps to improve on it. Hopefully, a few years from now, we won't just be pointing to a handful of different indie examples for games that have good dyslexia support in them. It's a couple of font options, and as accessibility requests go, it's one of the easier ones to implement. It's not like we're asking you to redesign your entire game, just let us maybe have alternative fonts. We're not movies, we're not books. This isn't a hard thing to offer people.